The Talmud reads, "Be pliable like a reed, not rigid like a cedar." Such advice is actually found in the literature of many different cultures, ancient cultures, including ours, our Jewish tradition. In its most common form, the idea is that a cedar, or sometimes an oak, depending on what literature you're reading, when confronted with a terrible storm, has no give. A cedar doesn't. And so if the storm is strong enough, the cedar is knocked over completely. The reed, however, is bendable. And so it is able to withstand a strong wind by tilting. It may become damaged during this storm, but it does not break. How can human beings be like these types of plants? Because that's the advice. We should be like this. The question is actually addressed in this week's Torah portion, Chaye Sarah, and in the Midrashim that surround it and elucidate it. The week's Torah portion begins with the words, Chaye Sarah, Sarah's life. But this sentence that begins the Torah portion actually goes on to describe not really her life, but rather her death. And the text gives us no information about why Sarah dies. In the Midrash, though, the rabbinic stories that have been passed down through generations, they do tell us, they give us a suggestion anyway, and we're going to delve into this in Torah study in the morning at 8:45 if anybody finds this particularly interesting. Sarah's death is the story that is told immediately after that famous one, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where Abraham, her husband, takes Isaac, her son, up to the top of Mount Moriah, ties him up, and is about to slit his throat. This is the story that comes right before her death, the story about her death. And so the rabbis tell us that the Akedah, the tale of Abraham and Isaac on the mountain, is what causes her death. The pain of the incident of Abraham consenting to bind and sacrifice his son was too great for her to bear, and this resulted in her death. If we remember, if you think back to earlier stories in the Torah, Sarah has sacrificed a great deal to ensure that Abraham will have a son who will survive and cause the family to thrive. That she takes this on as her life's mission. She gives Abraham Hagar, her servant woman, to have a child with when she thinks she can't bear children. And he does have a child with Hagar. Of course, that child is Ishmael. And Sarah must have felt great pain. We can't imagine that she wanted to offer her husband another woman to have a child with, but she does it anyway because she knows that this is what needs to happen. And she's so sure about what the future will look like that she makes this choice. Then she gives birth to a child in her extreme old age. And whether 90 means 90 or 90 means younger, we can be sure that she is much older than anybody else who's having a child at this moment. That's why she laughs. And we can imagine this must have been physically very straining on her. But she does it anyway because she's so sure about what the future must look like that she's going to sacrifice even her own body to produce this child. Then she insists that Hagar and Ishmael, these two people who are really members of her family, she insists that Abraham throw them out. She has no feeling for them, it seems. She wants them gone. She decides that they are standing in the way of her son being the star, and so she makes Abraham kick them out. We can imagine that Sarah, our matriarch, knew on some level that this was morally wrong, to cast out a woman and her child into the desert with no assurance that they'll live. We know this is wrong in our bones, and we know she did too. But she did it anyway because she knew what the world needed to look like, and so she didn't care about what was morally wrong. Finally, we have Abraham and Isaac on the top of Mount Moriah, a confusing, horrific incident that we're all probably pretty familiar with. And this incident changes, the rabbis say, her entire view of her life. The storm that ensues in her life because of this deviation from her plan that Isaac will live and be the next patriarch of the family, the Midrash says that this deviation caused her death. She was a cedar, unbending, unable to see any other point of view beyond her own throughout her life. And when her life did not cooperate with her and bend to her worldview, she had nowhere to go but down. And they don't blame her for this. They just say, this is what happened to her. She might, we can imagine, have said to herself what Tevye famously says in Fiddler on the Roof, in that famous line. He says, if I try to bend that far, I'll break. And Sarah broke. Abraham, her husband, on the other hand, is cast in our Torah as being much more sensitive. He's a listener, a risk taker, a trusting companion to all. He often does what God tells him to do throughout the story, and often those instructions deviate wildly from where he might have seen his life going. He has to leave his father's house with no assurance that he'll ever get to this place. He doesn't even know where this place is that he's supposed to go to. He has to sacrifice his treasured son, and we hear him acquiesce to this to some degree. But in every instance, he trusts the people around him and acknowledges that perhaps there is more to life than he is able to understand at any given moment. He seems to have a degree of humility that allows him to go through life this way. When Sarah tells him to cast out Ishmael and Hagar, we hear something very rare in the Torah, and you may not have ever noticed this. I never think about it until I read this portion. The Torah tells us that this matter of exiling Ishmael and Hagar troubled Abraham greatly. The Torah tells us how he felt. It never tells us how anybody really feels. It's usually what they did and what they said. But here we learn Abraham is troubled. And he's torn by this urging of his wife. And we learn that it was not so simple for him as it was for Sarah. Abraham is made of more emotional stuff, we think. And our rabbis tell us because of his sensitivity to people and his willingness to listen and his ability to acknowledge that he might be wrong or not know best, because of all that, he is able to survive the Akedah, the binding. Not only that, but he can move on from it. He finds a wife for Isaac in this portion. He remarries himself and has more children. He continues his relationship with God. The storm, though maybe a different storm, was just as great. But Abraham is like a reed, and he can bend, and so he does not break, the rabbis tell us. I think we're often like these two people, Sarah and Abraham. Sometimes we stand tall and strong like a cedar, unbending no matter what, so sure that we're right. We are afraid to shift our worldview at all, to shift our paradigms of how things should be. And when life throws curveballs at us, which it always does, we fall because we have been so shaken by the storm. Sometimes, though, we stand like Abraham in humbled awareness of our vulnerability and our humanity. We know that things aren't always as they should be, but reaching out and reaching up is always possible. When we stand like that and the storm comes, it hurts, but it does not break us. Our tradition says, be pliable like a reed and not rigid like a cedar. And if we do this, perhaps we will be able to weather the storms that come our way. This week, I read a news story that made me smile, and it made me think of this parashah and these midrashim about flexibility, that flexibility is such a prized trait. It's a story perhaps you read it too. It's a story about some women in Israel who are Haredi. They're ultra-Orthodox. And they are. That's the world they live in. And they are running for town council, these women, in their little town of Elad. One woman is quoted as saying, "I've been thinking about this for a year, and I think it's crucial. I've decided it's crucial that women be represented in the town council because there are just men now, and a lot of issues get lost. The storm of shifting gender roles, for example, may feel very predictable to us. We saw that storm coming. We've been in it a long time. But in many places around the world, including our own Jewish homeland, it is as massive and terrifying as a hurricane. And this little town in Israel, in a tiny way, I see a shift from a cedar to a reed. And it gives me hope for many such shifts in the future, in the national life of our people, perhaps, and also in our own personal relationships every day here in Memphis and at Temple, because who would have thought that that community could possibly go from cedar to reed? And if it can do it, we can do it too. So I close with this question and this prayer. May each of us ask ourselves, God, am I more like a cedar or a reed? Can I bend and tilt in my worldview enough to weather storms of shock and change, or do such storms knock me down? I pray, let each of us find our inner reed, the part of ourselves that's willing to bend just a little bit in order to come through hard times. Let each of us find within ourselves the capacity to be staunch in our ethics for ourselves, but giving in our understanding of other people and what the world sometimes asks of them and us. May we each remember that encountering and understanding God and the forces at work in our world takes a lifetime. And we learn more and more as we grow older about how little we know about the way the world works. And that is part of the human experience. May God help us weather the storms inside us, in our own families, in our community, and in our world. Amen.